Hey everyone, today we are looking at informed consent and the ethical, legal, and moral issues surrounding it in the medical community. When it applies, when it doesn't apply, what sorts of considerations we need to look at when talking about informed consent. Informed consent is the moral and legal right to accept or reject medical treatment. So when a patient is given a choice to undergo a surgery or not, informed consent says they need to have all of the information they would need to make a reasonable decision about this and give consent to it. They need to accept that treatment and not reject it, right? We can't go around performing surgeries on people that do not want them. There are three different, the text points out at least three different types of informed consent that are definitely going to be closely interrelated to each other, but may come apart in different cases. Or we may think that when a legal case of informed consent applies, the moral one might not, or vice versa. We might think that there are different levels and degrees of information that's required in the various types. But let's talk about those three types really quick. One, moral requirements. This is the ethical issues surrounding informed consent. Not just what the law says, not just what maybe the standard of community of physicians or community of healthcare workers says, but what are the real legal or real moral issues that are central to this idea of informed consent? And I think there's a lot of reasonable disagreement here, right? We might think some people might have really high bars for the information that's required in order to make an informed decision. Others might think you just have to have a sort of rudimentary understanding. And I think there are probably reasonable arguments for both of those. The second type of informed consent is the institutional and legal requirements that are surrounding informed consent. So when do we decide a patient is able to give informed consent? When do they have the capacity to give consent? What type of information needs to be divulged to that patient in order for them to count as being informed in the right way? And third, there's this informed consent that's sort of a joint decision-making process between a healthcare professional and a patient. For our purposes, we don't really need to talk about that third one too much, but we'll see cases in which maybe the first two types of informed consent may come apart. So when thinking about the ethical issues and legal issues surrounding informed consent, I think it's really useful to compare paternalism with autonomy and sort of see them as a sliding scale. So on the one hand, we have paternalism, and paternalism is the idea that doctors and healthcare professionals might, in some cases, know better than the patient, know what's in their best interests. Whether it's, the patient is afraid of the surgery or they don't quite understand how serious the disease is, et cetera, et cetera. We might think in those cases, the doctor really does know better and really has a better grasp on what's in the best interest of the patient. And someone who's maybe fond of medical paternalism might think, well, maybe there are some cases in which that paternalism is a good thing. But on the flip side, on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have complete respect for autonomy. So people should be, all else being equal, be able to make their own decisions about their body, their healthcare, about their treatment options, about exactly how they want to go about their healthcare. And if you think about it as a sliding scale, you can see that various people might in different situations think that autonomy is more important in this case, or perhaps paternalism is more important in cases where we think that the person just doesn't have the capacity to make a rational decision, whether the condition itself is somehow impacting it, or whether perhaps they are so afraid or in so much pain that they simply can't reason about it. And we'll see that the different elements of informed consent feed into this dichotomy between paternalism and autonomy. So, how do we know when the process of informed consent has happened? When has it been properly done such that we can reasonably say the patient has given informed consent? Turns out this is a really difficult thing to do, right? They point out some elements in the text that are key to both sort of the institutional standardized ways of measuring informed consent, as well as just the intuitive concepts that we might think apply in moral cases as well, in the strictly ethical sense of informed consent. And they suggest these are necessary criteria, meaning that in order for any type of informed consent to happen, you have to have these criteria. So my video went out here. I'm just going to do a quick voiceover recording with these attributes. As you can see, the different attributes are here. I think understanding and appreciation are relatively straightforward, right? The idea is that in order to understand, or in order to make an informed decision about your particular medical treatment and where you should go in your care, you have to understand and appreciate your situation. You have to understand the risks and the benefits, et cetera, et cetera. The others perhaps are a little more difficult and a little more gradated, meaning, or there's a scale of them, right? Having disclosed information, it might depend on what, we'll see later that it does to some extent, depend on the way that the physician thinks about the situation and whether or not the patient should know, for example, very risky side effects. But we'll look at these more in action when we're thinking about the cases. But here are the elements. Sorry about the video, but we'll get back to it right now. So when thinking about informed consent, one might worry that in certain circumstances when one isn't able to convey that they consent, let alone maybe make reasonable decisions about it, they can't, you can't disclose information to them because they are unconscious or something. And we have, you've probably heard of a living will before, where you can make decisions about certain medical scenarios, like if you'd want to be pulled off life support, if you ever, hopefully never have to do that, but or if you are incapacitated for whatever reason, if you want to do not resuscitate or don't want certain medications ever, even if it's life-saving. You can think about these types of documents like living wills or what the text calls proxy decision makers, where maybe it's a close friend, a loved one, a parent or a sibling or someone that's close to you, a partner, that knows your wishes and can communicate those if you are unable to for some reason. And these types of decision makers are called proxy decision makers because they are making it based on your preferences and your wishes about your treatment, but they are doing it on your behalf, right? So you might have a proxy decision maker who vehemently disagrees with your do not resuscitate order, but hopefully if they're faithful to the duty that you've asked of them, they might, in those cases, carry out your wishes and your preferences, even though you're not there and able to communicate them. Along the same lines, I want to talk about different factors that might influence our estimation of whether or not someone is able to give informed consent, whether they have the capacity. This chapter spends a lot of time talking about capacity. And I think the story with the factors that I'm going to mention here is relatively similar. We can talk about mental illness first, but in certain extreme cases, right, having a mental illness, let's say you have maybe an undiagnosed and untreated schizophrenia with delusions, that's going to make it very hard for you to give informed consent because you're having a tough time determining what's real and what's not, let alone trying to make complicated medical decisions. But for people who, have depression or have anxiety, I go through seasonal depression, but I don't think, struggle with depression, I don't think that this makes me incapable of making sound medical decisions. Now, could it influence them? Sure. And if you were having a particularly awful bout of depression, you might think that you do, to some extent, have this diminished capacity because you are having these intense feelings or these intense biophysiological reactions that are influencing your mood and probably influencing your ability to reason clearly. But those are extreme cases, and we want to make sure that we're not stigmatizing mental illness to the point that any mental illness label is automatically additionally attributed with this skepticism about the capacity for them to make informed medical decisions. And I think age and religion and all those race and gender, sex, any biases or maybe influences that we might think those play, it's important to keep it in perspective. Just because someone's older doesn't mean they are their mental faculties are gone, let alone they might not even be that diminished, right? Like there are plenty of older generation that have much more fine-tuned mental faculties than I do. And again, at the extremes, a newborn is unlikely to be able to consent, and someone maybe who is quite old and has lost some mental faculties, sure. But with religion, certain ideologies might come to bear. Thinking about things like Jehovah's Witnesses here. If you were someone who thinks that modern medicine is effective and is going to save lives and things like blood transfusions are good, you might think that someone who has strong beliefs against certain modern medical advances has some sort of diminished capacity. But that, again, seems unfair to suggest that just because one has that belief, they are wrong or unable to make competent medical decisions for themselves. And this is why the text, and I think talking about that sliding scale, especially when it comes to a legal concept of informed consent, we want to err on the side of autonomy usually, right? We don't want to be, I think at least in America especially, we have strong intuitions about personal freedom and personal liberty. And I think those just get amplified when you're talking about healthcare and making decisions about your health and your treatment options. And so erring on the side of the individual's right to choose and to have the freedom to pursue whatever treatment or no treatment that they want is probably a good legal precedent to have. So just like with a duty to treat or a duty not to abandon, there are exceptions to informed consent. One is just incompetency, just being incapable for whatever reason, whether you're unconscious or you're too young to have any ability to reason about your situation. Second, similar to like the Samaritan laws that say are going to hold you or are not going to hold physicians liable for treatment that they are giving in an emergency situation. They do this right so that doctors aren't scared to offer help in emergency situations because they're afraid of getting sued if they mess up in the heat of the moment or if the person didn't want help or what have you. In emergency care, this informed consent isn't always necessary, and it probably isn't always accessible. It's probably not always something you can actually get in that moment because you are dealing with an emergency situation, and the person undergoing that situation is probably unable to properly reason about their predicament, right? Unless they are the most cool-head person ever. I'm sure there are people like that, but you can see why this exception exists. Third, this is a really interesting one, and one that I'm going to be interested in hearing what people think about it. Hopefully we get some way to talk about it. This is the problem with not having in-class discussions is I can't hear what you guys think about this, but therapeutic privilege is a really interesting concept. It says that if a physician thinks that divulging a certain fact or set of information about the patient's either treatment or about their condition is likely to upset them so much that they would be unable to make a rational decision going forward, then they are possibly justified in withholding that information from them. I think there's a case study in the text about some sort of cancer treatment that has a scary side effect, but it's very rare. And they hold off on telling them about that scary side effect. And whether that's right or not, the thought is that scary side effect might, if it's death or something, right? That's a 0.000001 chance, but there's still a chance someone might be justifiably afraid and unable to make a rational decision about whether or not they should pursue treatment. Whether or not it's better than, say, foregoing treatment and a worsening condition or something like that. Again, really contentious, I think, and one that if you were a physician or any healthcare professional and you were thinking about possibly utilizing this in court, I would imagine you'd have to have a pretty convincing defense. And the interesting extras at the bottom of these notes, just quickly, I thought it was cool that they had these little extra tidbits. Some Q&As. We don't need to go through it here. You can read it in the notes, but I really found this chapter fascinating. I think it's interesting to think about, especially from like a healthcare professional's point of view, what information to divulge and what to hold back, and whether you're making the right ethical and moral decision is fascinating. And hopefully we can get some good discussion going. But if you want to send me an email, if you're thinking about it as much as me, go for it. I'd love to hear about it. Other than that, go ahead and do the quiz, the discussion board, and the paper prompts are now up, and you can see those in D2L as well. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.